Hello, friends. Today's podcast question says, I've listened to a few of your podcasts about homeschool curriculum. There's been advice on what not to use. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for high quality homeschool education curriculums. It's an interesting question. It's one we actually get frequently here at Foundation Worldview. And if I'm being honest, I did not want to record this podcast. And even as I'm recording it, I have a little bit of a stomach ache because I'm just thinking of all of the negative YouTube comments that there will be already. Because no matter what I say, many people will be upset. I'm not exactly sure why, but many people view their homeschool curriculum with such seriousness that if you say anything that could remotely suggest that what they're using is not the 100% top choice, it's almost as if you said their baby was ugly, which that is not at all what I'm saying. Your children are beautiful. They're image bearers of God. And your homeschool curriculum, if anyone's listening to this and you're already set in the curriculum that you use, anything you hear on this podcast today, please do not take it as a personal attack. Typically, I only do curriculum reviews if I think there is something that people need to be warned about. And so I'm pretty sure that the person who wrote in this question is responding to our YouTube video and podcast on the good and the beautiful curriculum, where I went through and highlighted how there is LDS teachings woven throughout and recommended that people who are of the historic Christian faith not use that curriculum. But the question then becomes, okay, so what curriculums should we use? So that's what we're going to explore today on the Foundation Worldview podcast, where we seek to answer your questions so that you can equip the children that God has placed in your care to carefully evaluate every idea they encounter and understand the truth of the biblical worldview. I'm your host, Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I'm thrilled that you've joined me for another episode today. Now, as we think through, wise homeschool curriculum options, I think that what's more important to cover than what specific curriculums we should use is how can we wisely approach any curriculum? How can we make the most of any homeschool curriculum that we're using without overburdening ourselves? Because I know that homeschooling is a huge task, that those of you who are making the investment to homeschool, I know that there is, the overarching blessing of it, that you are being the primary influencer, the primary disciple maker of your child. You have so much time with your children in these formative years. And I also know that part of that blessing also is somewhat of a burden. Not that your children are a burden, but that taking on the entire education of your child is no easy task. So today we're going to look at how can you wisely use a homeschool curriculum without overburdening yourself in this really huge task that you have taken on. Now, I'm sure many listeners will be disappointed with this next phrase, but just hear me out. I do not officially endorse any particular homeschool curriculum, and there is a reason for this. Now, this is not meant to be a criticism, just a statement of evaluation, is that as I have looked through the various homeschool curriculums, and I have looked through every major homeschool curriculum that's out there because I've been at so many homeschool conferences, I have not found any homeschool curriculum that truly teaches students to think critically from a biblical worldview. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't use those curriculums. You can still use those curriculums. I think it's just important to be aware that there aren't any curriculum publishers currently that are teaching students to think critically from a biblical worldview. Now, I'm sure many people who just heard that are feeling very angry and your emotions are running high. So if you need a moment, you can press pause on this and come back and hear my reasoning. If you don't want to hear the rest of this, you don't have to, because God has not put me in a position of authority over you. You have to make the decision that you believe is best for your children. However, if you'd like to know why I'm saying this, I'll continue. Now, when I first started Foundation Worldview, back in 2018. It was several years before the company became self-sustaining. So in order to make ends meet while I was working on Foundation Worldview, I also tutored a number of homeschool students in various subjects. And one of the families, the mom, she just said, you know what, I trust your judgment. Can you just find a curriculum that would work well for my children, and then use it with them? And I was like, sure. And that year I happened to be having a Foundation Worldview vendor booth at multiple homeschooling conferences and was speaking at a couple of them. And so during my hours in the vendor hall, my sister was very gracious. She traveled with me. She ran the booth, and I went around and I just looked at all of the curriculums that were available there. And I spoke to a representative, I believe, from every curriculum that I looked at. And almost every curriculum that I looked at said that they taught from a biblical worldview. And that's great, but I wanted to know what they meant by a biblical worldview. And so as I asked more questions, what was meant by teaching from a biblical worldview is that curriculum company, they published science from a young earth creationist perspective, that's what they meant by the biblical worldview, that they were teaching young earth creationism. Now that's not bad. I know that's the view of creationism that many families take, and it can be a great thing to teach science from that perspective. However, science is only one subject matter, and a biblical worldview encapsulates every area of life. And so as I went around to different curriculum vendors and was like, okay, give me an example of how you're teaching English language arts from a biblical worldview. The majority of the sales reps, what they did is they would show me something to the effect of the students were diagramming sentences, and those sentences were Bible verses, or they were about Bible characters, or they were about biblical morals. Now, diagramming Bible verses, diagramming Christian-based sentences, there's nothing wrong with that. But that's not actually a biblical view of English language arts. A biblical view of language arts is actually looking at why is it that we as humans can communicate? What is it about how we've been created makes it so that we can communicate? Then, as humans, how should we communicate? Now, I did find one curriculum. I think it was Bob Jones University Press, where they did have a little bit of this in their English language arts. They talked about why, as Christians, we should communicate clearly. But this fact of what is language, why is it that as humans we can communicate the way that no other creature on earth can? As humans, and specifically as Christians, how should we use our language to communicate with others and to others? And why should we do this? That's, a truly biblical view of that. Or when I pressed to ask for, like, what are some examples of how you teach mathematics from a biblical worldview, the answer was always about the ethics of how we do math. And most curriculum vendors said, oh, well, we would just say, math should be done as unto the Lord. One pulled out the verse from Colossians, I think it's Colossians 3:17, that talks about whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for man. Now, should our children work as for the Lord as not for man when they are doing math? Absolutely. That is a biblical principle, but that's not math from a biblical worldview. That's a work ethic from a biblical worldview. If we're looking at math from a truly biblical worldview, we're going to be investigating, why is it that there are constants in our universe? What is it about the design of the universe that makes it so that there are mathematical constants? And then why is it that we as humans can not only recognize symbols, some animals can recognize symbols, but we can actually imagine what has never been seen or experienced, such as certain things in mathematics. And so this is mathematics from a truly biblical worldview, not just working with a good work ethic. So as I was going around traveling to the different curriculum vendors, I eventually chose one of the vendors where I thought there was a decent amount of academic rigor. And I thought that that there was fewer examples of integrating the Bible in a less authentic way than some of the other curriculums that I saw. So if you're curious, I'll tell you, this is not an endorsement of this curriculum. This is just saying this is what I chose for the students I was working with. This might not be the best choice for you, but in that time, I did choose BJU Press because I thought there was a decent amount of academic rigor, and for the students I was working with, it was a good fit for them. And then what I did is I just supplemented where the curriculum was lacking. There was times where I would bring in biblical worldview questions. There was times where I felt like the assignment given wasn't academically rigorous enough, so I would tweak it for the students. Now, I tell all you this just to say, don't put your hope in a curriculum. There is no such thing as a perfect curriculum. Even here at Foundation Worldview, we're a curriculum creation company. Our curriculum is not perfect. We think it can greatly help you and benefit your family. Don't put all of your hope in our curriculum. And so what I'm encouraging you to do is to take the flexibility and the freedom that you are given in homeschooling, and then take a decent curriculum and make it work well for your family. So I think that there are 4 distinct steps that you can take in this process. So, first step, I think you should find a curriculum that works for your child and your family rhythms. I just shared with you what curriculum I chose when I was working with those homeschooling students, and I chose it because it worked well for them. It might not work well for your children. You are the expert on your child. You know your child better than anyone else ever can right now. And you also know what works best for your family rhythms and routines. Some of you who are homeschooling, you're very organized and type A, and you're able to plan things out really well. Some of you are more creative and you have trouble keeping a schedule and keeping on up with typical routines. So certain curriculums might not work for your family. Find what is a good fit for your child and for your family. Don't just think because that homeschooling A over here recommends this curriculum, it's going to work for your family, or because homeschooling B family over here recommends this curriculum, it's going to work well for your family. Find what works well for your child. Now, you might not find it right away. You might do one curriculum for a year and be like, wow, that did not work at all. That's okay. Doesn't mean that it's a lost year. Your child can learn from almost any curriculum. So don't view it as a failure, but just seek out a curriculum that works for your child and your family rhythms. Then the second thing that I recommend is move through that curriculum at a pace that aligns with your child's development. And what I mean by this is if your child already understands a concept, don't make them go through all of the lessons in that chapter. Allow them to take the chapter test or another form of assessment to prove that they already know that material. Don't feel like just because it's in the curriculum, you have to go through that lesson. That's one of the amazing things about homeschooling. In a classroom, when I was teaching, 24 to 29 students every year, they had to go through every single lesson because they were part of that class and I needed to go through that curriculum. Where when I was working as a tutor for homeschooling students, there were times where I would skip over an entire lesson or even chapter if the student already knew the material. Same thing that I've recommended personally to friends who are homeschooling. Several years ago, a friend called me and she was just asking me about math instruction for her kids. And they were part of a homeschooling co-op that was using Singapore math. And she was like, Elizabeth, she's like, it just feels so overwhelming that there's so much to do. And I feel like I can never get through a lesson, in the amount of time that we have to do math. And she's like, and in all honesty, my kids already know some of this. And I was like, if your kids know this, there's no harm in reviewing, but don't make them go through like an entire chapter that they already know this stuff. Then they're just going to, really not like the subject. I said, give them an opportunity to take an assessment to prove that they already know that. And if they already know what's in that chapter, move on. There's no reason that you need to go through that if your child already knows it and can prove they know it. Similarly, or I should say conversely, your child may need to move at a slower pace than what the curriculum allows. It might take them 2 or 3 times of going through the same content for it really to be solidified. So you might need to go through, chapter or unit 3 in your mathematics curriculum twice before your child understands how to divide fractions. And it's okay. Go through it again. Just make sure that you are continuing to progress. Okay. You don't want to get stuck on unit 3 for a whole year. So make sure that you're continuing to progress. This may mean that you need to extend your school year a little bit. Maybe you typically take the summers off and maybe you typically take June, July, and August off, but you find that there's a few units you have to go over multiple times. Well, you might need to extend your school year by a few weeks, and that's okay. Just work at a pace that's right for your child. The third thing that I recommend is I recommend including some secular resources to help your child learn to evaluate every idea they encounter. Now, this was actually another podcast somebody wrote in asking if I recommended using secular curriculum. And I said that I think that that can be a great idea. We got tons of negative reviews on YouTube. People were very upset about this, but you don't have to use a secular curriculum. I just recommend implementing or integrating some kind of secular resources, because if all you're doing is showing your children Christian content, they are going to be completely unprepared for the day that they go out into the real world and they're confronted with tons of non-Christian content. So easy ways to do this. So if you use a Christian homeschooling publisher and all your materials are coming from Christians, an easy way to do this is purchase a subscription to Scholastic News. Okay, so Scholastic News is written from a very secular standpoint. And so I looked it up yesterday. If you want digital access for 6 months to their weekly Scholastic News, so that's a Scholastic News edition every week for 6 months, it's $34. Or if you want both digital access and print access, it's $42, and you'll have the Scholastic News not only in your inbox, but also coming in the physical mail to you. They also have something called Scholastic Spin, which is a science edition of Scholastic News that can be added on for only $10. And so this is getting weekly secular content that you can take your kids through to evaluate the ideas there. There'll be a lot of good stuff and a lot of true stuff, and there will also be a lot of faulty worldview assumptions there. Now, if you have taken your child through our comparative worldview curriculum here at Foundation Worldview, and then you take your child through Scholastic News, probably without your prompting, they are going to be able to pick up on the majority of the faulty worldview assumptions. I found this in my own classroom when I taught third grade at a Christian school. When I first started teaching third grade, we got something called God's World News, which it was put out, I think, by World Magazine. And it was the news, the weekly news from a Christian perspective. And I really appreciated it, but I thought, man, the students here, like they're not getting an opportunity to evaluate the news from a biblical perspective because they're getting fed it from a biblical perspective. So I asked for permission to switch over to Scholastic News, and we did. And then once I started teaching my students through Foundation Comparative Worldview curriculum, we would pick up the weekly reader, the weekly Scholastic News, and my students on their own would be like, oh my goodness, Miss you, look at, they're coming from a naturalistic perspective of humans over here. Or Miss you, oh my goodness, look at this article. It's coming from postmodern view of right and wrong. So if your child has already gone through our comparative worldview curriculum and then you bring Scholastic News into the mix, it will be an amazing way for your child to be able to pick up on faulty worldview assumptions in the material presented to them. Also, if you haven't checked out our book club yet at Foundation Worldview, we just revamped our book club, and our book club can actually fit this need of providing you with some secular material, because what we've done this year is, rather than reviewing Christian literature, which we've done in the past, we've switched over to providing book recommendations that are secular. And then we give you worldview questions to talk through with your child to pick up on the different worldview themes and evaluate them from a biblical perspective. So those are just some easy ways to add a secular source to your homeschool day to give your children the opportunity to carefully evaluate secular ideas. Then the fourth thing that I recommend is, as you're working through your homeschooling curriculum, add in a biblical worldview question in most of the units that you covered. As I mentioned at the beginning, even though most Christian homeschool publishers claim to be teaching kids to think critically from a biblical worldview, what they mean by that usually does not involve much critical thinking or a distinctly biblical worldview. So I think if you add in a distinctly biblical worldview question into each or just to most of the units that you teach, it can really help your children begin to think biblically. Now, there are 3 different ways that you can add in biblical worldview questions. The first thing you can do is you can look at what is the biblical purpose behind studying this subject. Okay, what is the biblical purpose behind studying math or science or social studies or literature? The second thing you can do is you can consider the biblical worldview assumptions behind a topic. And the third thing you can do is you can compare and contrast the biblical worldview assumptions with secular assumptions. Now, I'm not recommending that you do all of these 3 things in every unit. I mean, if you want to do all of these three things and you're equipped to do that, more power to you. You can just choose one of these. And it can be a really helpful way to equip your child to think biblically through the subjects. Now, I'm going to give you an example of how you can do this. with the subject of spelling. So I'm going to walk you through, how could you, one, look at the biblical purpose behind spelling? Two, how could you consider the biblical worldview assumptions behind spelling? And three, how could you compare and contrast those biblical worldview assumptions with secular assumptions? So when we're thinking about spelling, what is the biblical purpose of spelling? Okay, that's a question you could even ask your child and say, we're going to explore that this unit. What is the biblical purpose of spelling? And then there's several different things that you can explore, and you don't need to explore them all at the same time. You can explore them over different spelling units. One biblical purpose behind spelling is that we communicate through written words because we bear God's image, and God has communicated to us through written words. That's one biblical purpose behind spelling that you could explore during one spelling unit. Another biblical purpose for spelling is that we communicate through written words to get to know others and to let others get to know us. And this is important because as God's image bearers, we are relational just as He is relational. That's another biblical, purpose for spelling that you could explore in a different unit. Another biblical purpose would be we should learn to spell correctly so that we communicate clearly and reflect God, that God communicates clearly. And so we reflect Him when we learn how to communicate clearly. So those are three different biblical purposes for studying spelling that you could explore in spelling units. Second thing, we're looking at biblical worldview assumptions. In different spelling units, you could explore what are some biblical worldview assumptions behind spelling. Well, some of those assumptions are that humans communicate through language as God's image bearers. Another biblical worldview assumption is that we're going to struggle to spell at times because we have finite minds. Okay, God is the only one who is infinite. We are finite. So there's going to be times where we're going to struggle spelling correctly. Another biblical worldview assumption is that we will at times miscommunicate through written words and spoken words because we're fallen. And this is one of the effects of the fall, miscommunication. So those are different biblical worldview assumptions you could explore in different spelling units. Then you could also take the biblical worldview assumptions about spelling and compare and contrast them to secular worldview assumptions. So a secular worldview assumption about spelling would be we communicate through written words because we're the most highly evolved creatures. Okay. And another worldview assumption would be our language is an accidental result of evolution. Okay. So you can take those assumptions and say, okay, how is that different than the biblical worldview? Well, in the biblical worldview, we humans are the purposeful creation of God, and we are to use language as we bear God's image. So this is completely different. The first is accidental, the secular assumption. The biblical assumption is purposeful. Another secular assumption about spelling would be we should learn to spell well so that we can communicate clearly and advance in society. Then we can talk to our kids. Okay, what about that is similar or different from the biblical worldview? Well, the biblical worldview agrees that we should learn to spell well so that we can communicate clearly. Okay, we want to communicate clearly to reflect God well to others. But it's different in that our purpose in learning to communicate clearly is not just to advance and to get ahead of others, but it's to reflect God well. Again, if you have taken your child through Foundation Comparative Worldview curriculum, these are the kind of biblical purposes and assumptions that they are going to naturally recognize, as well as the secular assumptions from other worldviews. So I know this podcast has been a little bit longer, but just to summarize and to review, the four things that I think any homeschooling family can do and should do with curriculum is one, find a curriculum that works for your child and your family rhythms. Two, move at a pace that aligns with your child's development. Three, include some secular resources to help your child learn to evaluate every idea they encounter. And four, add in biblical worldview question or a biblical worldview question in most units. It's my prayer that just this four-part framework will help relieve some of the burden that you may feel as you are homeschooling, and just assure you that the curriculum that you're using, you can take it, you can make sure that it aligns with how God has designed your child, and you can use it to equip your child to think critically and biblically. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. But if you have a question you would like for me to answer on a future Foundation Worldview podcast, you could submit that by going to foundationworldview.com/podcast. As we leave our time together, my prayer for you is that no matter the situation in which you and the children God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of His Son. I'll see you next time.